So the next speaker is going to discuss the impact of those rising sea levels and the history and evolution of our response to them. Bob Yaro is someone that I met 35 years ago in Massachusetts. I was a state senator in Massachusetts, city solicitor, filed a lawsuit to clean up Boston Harbor, and Bob was deeply involved in that and so many other things. Bob is a planner, but he's the type of planner that really goes to make a difference today. He's interested in long-range planning, but he's also a strategic planner. And Bob, several years ago, and I ran into each other, and we started talking about New York and planning efforts here. And we realized that both of us believed in this concept of a regional storm surge area. So Bob was a member of the Storm Surge Working Group, and who is professor of practice of city and regional planning at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also president emeritus of the Regional Plan Association. For over 20 years, Bob Yaro has guided the most strategic planning that has occurred in the city of New York. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Bob Yaro.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks everybody for coming today. I was just thinking, I was last in this room about 10 days after Sandy. Regional Plan held a conference in partnership with the mayor's office in the city of New York to figure out what we were going to do to pick up the pieces after Sandy. This hotel nearly flooded. A bunch of the other establishments in Lower Manhattan did flood. Marriott was just barely high enough that it didn't flood. And I remember thinking, I'm a regionalist, it goes with the work at Regional Plan Association, and I really believe that, as Malcolm and Bill have said, is that storms like Sandy are regional events. It doesn't just hit New York City or Bayonne or Jersey City, it hits the entire metropolitan area, and that's why we're thinking about a layered defense. And unfortunately, that day, I remember I had a meeting with Mayor Bloomberg. Al Gore was here to do a laying on of hands of just how important it was that we get this right. But the mayor immediately took off the table the idea of a regional approach. And he told me, I raised it with him, and he said, famously, he said, Bob, he said, King Canute couldn't keep out the tides, and neither can I. And, what I wanted to say, I didn't say it because he was the mayor, was, well, King Canute didn't fly to Bermuda every weekend, and you seem to be doing okay. And I got some, but I didn't say that, but I did raise this idea with his staff, and so for a variety of reasons, principally, and it's not just the mayor, but I think a number of people in the region feel that in a way, sea level rise and storm surges are kind of divine retribution for all the bad things we've done to the climate and Mother Nature, and we just have to take our medicine and live with the water coming in and going out and so forth. At any rate, the group of people that Malcolm has been leading over the past couple of years, the working group, believe that in fact that we ought to be thinking about regional approaches. So Sandy was a wake-up call. I lived in Stamford, Connecticut at the time, and it really literally was, Stamford's one of 3 cities in the Northeast that have hurricane barriers, a product of the 38 hurricane. Everybody said, that was terrible, but it'll probably never happen again. And I think 16 years later, Hurricane Carol hit all of those cities, and the same devastation occurred again. And the second time they said, okay, we've got the message, we have to do something about it. They built hurricane barriers. I lived in Stamford at the time, and Stamford, the lights stayed on, the water stayed out. It was a rainy day, and there was some wind, but everything was fine. We had an 11-foot surge, but as you'll hear later on, we have a 17-foot high surge barrier, and so the water, was kept down. All of our neighbors on the Sound were devastated by Sandy, as was the rest of the region. So it was the wake-up call, but we didn't quite heed the warning. And I guess the question, Malcolm is a scientist, I'm not, but everything that I've read, I think we all understand, is that there probably will be future storms, and they may be even more devastating as a result of climate change than they've been in the past. And so, I guess one approach is that we could just wait till the next storm and live with another, that was a $60 billion storm for the entire metropolitan area and 100 people died. Do we need to do that? Again, 75 million in damage for the whole Northeast and 100 dead. But I think the prudent thing to do is to heed the warning and respond. But up until now, we've been advancing a set of local responses in New York City and Hoboken and other cities across the region, not the kind of layered approach that Bill talked about and Malcolm talked about, with a regional barrier system backed up by local barriers. So what we've got are, literally dozens of barriers, and then there have been a number of folks who've been pursuing what I call soft solutions, the idea of created wetlands or oyster reefs, that sort of thing. But in fact, these are really important to restoring the environmental systems of the estuary, but they don't provide the kind of protection that we need. So the SIR report that Bear Bloomberg announced in this room about a week after Sandy was initiated, and it came up with more than 100 proposed local defense barriers. And when you add it up and you had to dig a bit in the report, it was more than $20 billion of recommended investments. This was 5 years ago, so a lot more than that now. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Rebuild by Design program proposed a number of other projects costing billions more. So we are proposing to invest a lot of money, and you can read this map, but each one of these things represents a proposed local barrier or berm or some other technique. But these large areas of the region protected, as Bill mentioned in his opening remarks. We've got 808 miles of waterfront. The map that Bill put on actually wasn't quite accurate. What the working group has been working on this proposal that would also include some smaller barriers across the South Shore inlets on Long Island to protect the communities in Nassau and Suffolk that are on the back bays and that have devastating floods and so forth. So we are proposing something that would protect the entire region. Under the current strategy, places like Breezy Point, the Breezy Point community that was so devastated by Sandy, the rest of the Rockaways, something in excess of 100,000 people living in the Rockaways and so forth, are going to have an enhanced dune system and so forth, but flooding occurred off Jamaica Bay, and that would continue under current plans. And many of the poorest communities in the region are going to be left outside of these protected areas. And we now know that after the last 5 years that, in fact, a set of investments called for in the SIR report and the Rebuild by Design that were supposed to be fast, relatively inexpensive, and effective, many of these things are turning out to be taking a lot more time, to be not quite as effective as originally anticipated, and many of them have engendered local controversy as people have discovered that their lovely view of New York Harbor is going to be blocked by a 12 or 14 foot high wall. So they're not achieving the original objective. But meanwhile, other cities around the world, and this is really what's inspired our work, is that all of our global counterparts, similarly situated cities that face the kinds of storm surge threats that we do, either already have built barriers, and this is an image of the Thames barrier in London that's been in place for 30 years. They're now planning a new barrier that will be farther downstream and protect a much larger area and have a much higher wall and so forth. And again, and this is the Rotterdam barrier on the right. And the new technology that's being used is the idea of movable barrier systems that are open 99.9% of the time. The only meaning the natural flows and fisheries and the natural systems and water quality are totally unimpaired. The only time that these barriers are closed is when there is a storm surge, which happens only very rarely. And as you've seen, we're looking at a barrier system that would create this kind of layered defense for the region. So the local barriers that New York City and Hoboken and other cities are building would be there to protect against sea level rise, but we would have this regional barrier system to protect us from storm surges for at least a century or until we have to do something else because of sea level rise. So the primary barrier between the tip of Breezy Point and the northern tip of Sandy Hook, a berm system that would be very much like the Dutch barriers that protect virtually all of the population centers of the Netherlands, naturalized under dunes and so forth, so that most people wouldn't even know that they're there. but would protect the whole core of the metropolitan area. And this works because, again, Malcolm had the chart. I'm a sailor, and so I've sailed in these waters. Most of, it looks like open waters, relatively shallow, other than the Ambrose Channel, the dredged shipping channel. It makes it possible to build a barrier in this area to protect the vast majority of the residents and economic assets and infrastructure in the metropolitan area. There'd be a secondary barrier up by the Throgs Neck Bridge to prevent the kind of flooding off of Long Island Sound that Malcolm described. And again, this is off-the-shelf technology. This is not something new. It's not the space shot stuff. This is the barrier in these images of the New Bedford hurricane barrier that was built after the 38 and 54 hurricanes, and has protected New Bedford. Bill has pointed out that it's now the largest fishing fleet in the United States that is now protected by this barrier system. And we've got this problem that I think a lot of people who've rallied to the resiliency banner have felt that, well, there's really nothing we can do to keep the water out, and we just have to live with water. And this is to some extent, but there are also things that we can do to prevent the worst ravages of flooding. And what we really want to initiate with today's conference is a rational discussion about the merits of this idea. We're not saying let's go build this thing tomorrow. We're saying let's take a serious look at this idea and look at how we can create the kind of layered defense that other cities around the world have already created. And so I just went through just an outline of what the major arguments have been against these things. And the first one is that, well, we can't mess around with Mother Nature and the natural flow of the waters and so forth, but Malcolm's colleagues at Stony Brook and others have pointed out that if we design this system, we could design it so that the Throgs Neck Barrier, for example, would be closed on the incoming northbound tide on the East River every day. About 10% of the water that goes into Long Island Sound every day comes into the East River. 90% comes in off the Race and Plum Gut and Watchell Passage on the east end. That if we closed it on the incoming tide, then in fact we could prevent most of the problem of hypoxia, of low oxygen water, nitrogen-laden waters, and so forth that have devastated western and central Long Island Sound. And we can actually create a much cleaner, we flushing water off the ocean from the east end of the Sound down the East River, and it could very well be that the oyster beds in New York Harbor that once restored, we could actually eat the oysters because we'd have an improved estuary water quality both in the Western Sound, but also the East River and the New York Harbor. So we think this is one of the options that needs to be explored. So we don't have to assume that there's going to be environmental damage. There might be environmental benefits and water quality benefits. The other argument is, well, these things cost too much. And the estimates that were done by engineers before Sandy was that a barrier system this time would cost $5 to $10 billion, depending on how it was done. Let's say it costs 10 or 15 billion or even 20 billion to build the kind of protection that we're talking about for the entire metropolitan area. We just had a $75 billion storm from a storm that wasn't even a hurricane. How many of these are we going to get for the next 100 years? What's the value of the region, the insurance policy that this would provide to protect our airports and seaport and the subways and the other infrastructure facilities that flooded and so forth. So we think that even at that high cost, that in fact this is a tiny fraction of what the cost of the damage would be over the next century from not doing this. That it would take too long to build, and as we'll hear later on from our representative from New Orleans, that in fact when we decided to do things in this country, and Governor Cuomo demonstrated this with the new Tappan Zee Bridge, we went from, everybody said, well, that takes too long, it could take 20 years and so forth, and when the governor decided that we were going to do this, we went in less than a year from the decision to proceed to a construction start. Permitting, procurement, the preliminary design, all completed in less than a year. So we're capable of doing these things when we find the political will and resolve to do it. In New Orleans, the Corps of Engineers built a $14.5 billion barrier in less than 5 years. And why did they do it? Because Katrina was so devastating and the politics demanded that they move quickly. Some people would say that the technology is untested, but again, this is technology that we're talking about, the movable barrier systems that have been in place for 50 years or more, demonstrated around the world. These systems work. This is New Bedford on the left. That's Bill's light ship. He's very modest about his light ships, but they're protected by the Savannah, living proof that these things work. It's behind the barrier. After being in New York Harbor for Sandy, he said, never again. He's up in New Bedford for now. And on the right, the new Rotterdam barrier, which you can see a major shipping channel and so forth. But this thing works. Water levels would be raised. And Malcolm has spent a lot of time on this thing, and it turns out that on the estimates that he and other scientists have done, that if we close these barriers, it might raise the water levels outside of the ocean by an inch or two, on Long Island Sound by a few inches. It turns out that the New York Bight is a very large body of water, and closing the barrier for a few hours during the peak of a storm surge is not going to prevent flooding outside the barrier system. Some people have said that created wetlands and oyster beds would provide the same kind of protection. It turns out that these are wonderful amenities, and we ought to be doing this to restore water quality and habitat in the harbor. But when you come right down to it, that they will not protect the region from storm surges. During critical conversation, with advocates, I was on the 2100 Commission, the governor's post-Sandy commission, and in a critical conversation with advocates for oyster beds and created wetlands, they admitted that in fact these would not prevent the kind of storm surges. Might prevent a couple of inches. We had a 14-foot surge with Sandy, so nice to have, but it's not going to protect us. So let's move on. That they would leave large areas, the barriers that we've proposed to leave large areas of the region unprotected. We think that in fact the whole core of the metropolitan area of New York City, the whole North Jersey coastline, the whole South Shore of Long Island, and the East River and the Western Sound would be protected. So probably 90% of the population, even larger share of the infrastructure, the economic assets of the region would be protected, by the barrier system that we have proposed. There's this argument by some resilience advocates that we get a kind of dividend from living with water, and that this is a National Guardsman in Hoboken after the storm, patrolling the devastated area of Hoboken, flooded area of Hoboken. I would argue that keeping the lights on and the water out and keeping devastation from occurring and not having to have National Guardsmen on the streets is probably a good way to build social capital, but we can have that conversation. Some people would say they're not reliable, and again, these systems have been in place. The London barrier has been in place for almost 40 years now. It is protected London impeccably. The New Bedford barrier on the left, Stamford's barrier has been in place since the late 60s, and again, for 40 years it's protected Stamford from flooding. So these systems work, and they work flawlessly. And finally, what about sea level rise? And this is something that we've spent a lot of time on at the working group. That the answer is that with even 6 feet or more predicted sea level rise, that this barrier would be effective probably into the middle of the 22nd century. And at that point, we're going to have to get creative. And my argument has been that, I led, when I worked for Michael Dukakis, Governor Dukakis, after the 78 coastal storm that devastated barrier beaches and islands and coastal communities, I ran the first large-scale retreat program. We bought out damaged coastal properties. We had $100 million of state and federal funds that the governor and Senator Tsongas got. I ran that program, and it has its place, and there are places that we probably shouldn't try to protect with a barrier system of this kind. But I would argue that 130, 150 years is the kind of time that we're going to need to reinvent our civilization if in fact we're going to see even more extreme amounts of sea level rise. And 150 years is a good round number in infrastructure planning. London's barrier is 40 years old. They're now planning a new barrier that will be even higher, farther east to protect an even larger area. That's the kind of prudent long-range planning that we ought to be thinking about here. I told my folks at Regional Plan before I retired that we should put a note files, whatever kind of electronic files that people are going to be using 150 years from now when RPA is now completing the 4th regional plan, when they're doing the 10th regional plan, that they ought to be taking a close look at what to do to replace this kind of layered system. So how do we move forward with this? I guess I would argue that what's missing is the political will. We need to ask our elected leaders. We can't expect them to stick their necks out and do this on their own. They're only going to provide the kind of leadership if, in fact, there's a strong base of political will and political support from the kinds of people and the kinds of groups represented in the room today. So we need to build that base of support. That's really where we're going. Well, we've been sitting around for the last 5 years not doing this. It's really interesting. I get a big kick out of the folks in Texas. That they don't believe in sea level rise or climate change, but when the water bill was being put together by the Congress, Senator Cornyn dropped a $300 million item and an explicit authorization for the Army Corps of Engineers to engineer a Houston Galveston Bay barrier system. And so I think we do believe that sea level rise is happening and that climate change is occurring. So maybe we could find the political will to do the same thing here. And there'll be a vehicle, I suspect, in a few years when Houston comes back looking for the construction money, which they will do, that we should be moving ahead, with engineering and construction of a barrier system here. Boston's now moving ahead with engineering on a barrier system. They're a little ahead of us, but they're responding to the same kinds of concerns that we have here. And again, I'm big fan of Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln. He famously said, I think it was his second inaugural, that to save the country we needed to disenthrall ourselves from the quiet dogmas of the past. And the same applies here, that we have to get out of our own way. We have to start looking at these issues in a new way. We have to start believing in the future of this region, and that means creating the kind of long-term strategies to protect this region from the kinds of threats that we faced with Sandy and that we will face again many, many times in the future. Thank you very much.